and suffering, kind, and usually soft-spoken, often wanting to step back into the background and not be noticed so much for their contribution. Behavior that in the Christian teaching would certainly be called saintly behavior. And yet there will also be a deep sense of connection to an awareness of God, but it's a heart-based connection. It's devotional, as opposed to with the mystics, where there's a concept of God as the absolute. The empaths have the concept of God as a loving father or a loving mother or a loving presence or something of this nature. The challenge of the empaths is, once again, everything that I'm saying is the truth for them. And they think that the mystics live in a cold, harsh, unpleasant universe and feel sorry for them. The mystics don't necessarily feel sorry for anybody, but the empaths feel sorry for the mystics because of what they miss when they are trying not to love, because that creates entanglements with other people. My experience of mystics when they are near, empaths when they are near mystics, is the mystics consider them not merely unintelligent, but deeply unintelligent. And this is unfortunate in the Theosophical Society because there is such a strong idea of service that goes back to Blavatsky and is talked about in the key to Theosophy. And again, Blavatsky and her wisdom realized there would be no cure for this absolutist mysticism if they did not learn how to be of service to others. So, if you are sitting in a room of people discussing the secret doctrine, it's probable that the mystics will all always agree with each other about everything that they're saying. But they're saying it in a language no one else in the room can understand. Or sometimes fighting about it because of a different definition of the words. And if there are any empaths in the room, they are shocked because there's so much intensity. And I've heard groups in the United States, I've heard people in the groups say, oh yes, we meet once a week for 1 hour and study the secret doctrine, and the minute the hour comes, everybody runs out of the room and goes home. So, again, I think the lack of heart and empathy is a part of that. But you will always find in the administration of any of the theosophical groups people who are deeply loyal to the group, as an expression of group consciousness, working behind the scenes and finding ways to be of support to other people. It's also very typical of empaths to make a statement like this: I never watch the news. There's so much suffering in the world. I see enough of it around me. I can't look at the suffering in the world, or I can't get out of bed in the morning. Now, this is a very real experience. The aspect of the empaths that deals with union is just always embracing all other beings and forgets often about self-care and is overwhelmed by the amount of need in the world. It's clear that they need to learn to create boundaries for themselves. They can only learn that by learning some lessons about identity. In the same way, the mystic has to learn something about how to open up and embrace all others in oneness. And this is one of the reasons why in the voice of the silence, the idea of selfish Buddhas is brought up. The mystics who are the selfish Buddhas are the ones who pursue enlightenment for their own benefit, simply to transcend, to be liberated. Whereas the way that's actually promoted in the voice of the silence is you come up to the point when you're allowed to enter nirvana and you say, no, I will be of service to all beings, and when they have gone into nirvana, I will go into nirvana. This is a prevention of the mystics simply going off and leaving the universe behind. We don't want that, because if they have a direct connection to truth, truth being understanding the difference between what is real and what is unreal, we need them as teachers. But they may not want students, because that means entanglements, right? So what I want to emphasize here is that there's a beautiful balance between these three types. They all need each other. So the empaths need a reminder about truth too, that there's something deeper than empathic relationship as a truth. And we can know this from the history of the Theosophical Society by looking at its very beginnings. So Madame Blavatsky began as a spiritualist, and at a certain point she began challenging the spiritualists in America. The spiritualists, in effect, were saying, our mediums are in touch with Grandma. Grandma comes through our mediums. You can talk to Grandma. Grandma will embrace you from the other side. And Madame Blavatsky would say, are you sure it was Grandma? Might it have been a nature spirit? Might it have been an elemental? Might it have been 5 or 6 other things that they never thought of? And the spiritualists would say, no, it's Grandma. We know it's Grandma. And she would say, how do you know? Because we know. So as a result, Blavatsky was, in a sense, pushed out of spiritualism, or she felt like she wanted to create the Theosophical Society to represent a more balanced and comprehensive view. Because as far as she was concerned, if people are going to a spiritualist medium to talk to Grandma, that can't be good for them or for Grandma. Because Grandma can't go off into the next phase of the afterlife because you keep calling her back, and you are clinging. And Buddhism teaches don't cling. So that is one of the challenges of being an empath. Everything is based on relationship, and that becomes the truth. And the truth of the truth is sometimes lost in that. We can think, for example, of, I may need a little help for those of you who speak Dutch to find the right words so that we have the same understanding as I do. But in psychology, there's something called enabling behavior. And enabling behavior is, let's say you have a couple, a married couple, and one of them is an alcoholic, and the other one engages in enabling behavior. What this means is, oh, you're not an alcoholic, you only drink 3 glasses of wine for dinner. If you drank 4, you would be an alcoholic, so wine is okay. Or the alcoholic comes to the meal and the wine is always on the table, whether or not the other person drinks. That's a crude example of what I mean by enabling behavior. Does anyone have an idea of how to describe that in Dutch so that we can all be on the same page?
Codependency?
Codependency, yes. Is this understood? Codependency? Okay. So, codependency is something that often happens for empaths, for the simple reason that the mystics, even less developed mystics, love to have all of their needs satisfied with perfect telepathic understanding and no real need for them to say anything. And of course, the empaths know how to do this, but in a sense, they can be enslaved in a relationship like this. Narcissistic individuals often have some of this identity, mystical energy in them, and it's very frequent that a narcissistic individual will end up being paired with an empathic individual. So you see, the types that I'm talking about don't apply only to higher levels of spiritual growth. And what is difficult is for empaths to realize that they need to love strongly, not just allowing everything, but standing up for themselves. We have a phrase in English, love that stands its ground. In other words, tough love. I'm not moving. I love you. I'm not moving from that position. Without this, the empaths are easily oppressed, suppressed, pushed down by others. So, all of the types have their glories and their sufferings. That's the thing that we need to be aware of. Any questions or comments about empaths? Yes, here's one. Arnold.
No, just yeah, sorry.
You probably said it before, but I forgot it. But are we generally just one type, or are all these types, this mystical, this empath and the seer, are they all included in us?
We have one type that is basic to ourselves, and then we have to learn about the other two types. Now, in order to understand what this means, we have to understand that the universe is energy, information, and consciousness. And each of us has an inner sensibility that prioritizes one of those ways of looking at things. So the mystics see primarily energy and the truth behind the energy. The empaths see primarily consciousness and the relationship between other beings. And the seers primarily see information and imagery. These are our beginning points. Ultimately, we need to have a perfect balance between union and identity. Union and identity need to be integrated. So if we start with union, we need to add identity, we need to be integrated. So that would be a movement for someone who starts as an empath, learns some lessons about being a mystic, and then finds a way as a seer to integrate things.
So you're not enrolling all the characters in yourself, like if I think I'm an empath, I don't have an inner mystic as well.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'll come back to that.
Okay, thank you.
The easiest thing about it will be if I can explain, after I've talked about the seers, if I can explain my own personal journey, and then I think it will all fall.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? Maybe the best way to say it is we may not be born with an inner mystic, but we may develop it. Or we may have developed it in a past life, and when we come into this lifetime, we begin with what we already know best and then gradually integrate the others. But I believe, and again, this is my belief, that each of us has a journey back to Source, and at the end of that journey, we will become the best expression of one of the three types. And so, for a mystic, that is a soul teacher, someone who teaches the difference between the real and the unreal. For the empath, it's a soul healer who heals the separations within and between beings. And for the seer, it's a soul guide, someone who sees who individuals are and helps them get to the place they need to be for the next step in their growth. I think those roles, or the possibility of developing into those roles, are assigned from the beginning of our cycle as consciousness developing. And then at the end, we are a full manifestation of any one of these three types. All I can say is it's a speculation, because I haven't gotten to the end of my evolutionary cycle, and it's not coming within this lifetime, I'm fairly certain. So, but what I know is, if I live and understand the world as a seer, holding on to the idea that there are mystical elements of energy and truth, and empathic elements of consciousness and relationship, then I have the best, happiest, most productive experience of my presence on the planet. I would not have it if I were only a seer, but I'll say more about that in a moment. Anyone else? Yeah.
If somebody, I hear a lot lately, people talking about space. The space, anything happens in the space that is being held, space for something to be witnessed in. Is this more an empath trait, or is this more a mystical trait?
Yeah, very good question. So, I mentioned earlier that at the higher levels of development, those on the mystical path become karmic law enforcers. But it's more than that. They know the laws and the powers of the universe. They're perfectly capable of becoming the god of the next universe. Now, in their dark magician phase, they may have wanted to push God out of this universe and replace him. They get their wish, just not in this universe. The thing is, they know how important laws and powers are to the structure of the universe, because of having made the effort to learn about, transcend them, break them, that they experienced in the present universe. And if you wish, you can think of their ultimate karma being the god of the next universe, who knows all of the tricks of the dark magicians and mystics of that universe, that they then, have to outwit as they continue with upholding the structure of that universe. Now, in a corresponding way, these mystics or wrathful deities or karmic police are balanced by the highest level of the empaths, which is as the compassionate deity teachers. So, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the big issue in the bardo is that the minute you enter it, the bardo being a version of the afterlife, all of your thoughts, all of your feelings, all of your desires, all of your karma instantly manifests as demons or something that chases you. And you only want to be free of it, and you run and run and run until you find what seems to be the only place of safety. And that is in the womb of a woman on the physical plane who will then bring your soul to birth and in your body. So the wrathful deity teachers and the compassionate deity teachers offer interventions to see if you are able to free yourself from all of that. And the way they do it is they send down what are called light hooks. So the compassionate deities send down a light hook. The Tibetan Book of the Dead says, look for a light hook or something similar. You see it, and if you grab onto it, you'll be lifted up into a state of consciousness called clear light mind, where you perceive the nature of reality and illusion and so on. If you don't see it, you might find, for example, that the hook looks too sharp or too bright or too powerful. You might miss that opportunity. It then may come again, but it comes in a stronger way. And each time the intervention is stronger until finally you've demonstrated that you can't hear it, and then rebirth occurs. So my understanding now of what the compassionate deity teachers do is they create realms in the afterlife. So remember, they embrace, and they're the aspect of omnipresence, as I mentioned in this chart. What they do is they create a space within which people who have died can develop. And the only way to do that is to slow down the experience of thought turning into experience. So they slow down time, you could say, so that you have an opportunity to perceive the thought arising, the thought manifesting, and then can experience the consequence of the thought manifesting, and then realize that when you were in life, it would have been impossible for you perhaps to have that kind of attentiveness. And that's why there were negative karmic consequences. However, you can see a different way of doing it when you're between lifetimes, and perhaps take that information with you into your next lifetime. So the highest level in Tibetan Buddhism, at least in Pure Land Buddhism, is called the Western Paradise of Amitabha Buddha, or help me somebody, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. So this Western Paradise is the body of this Buddha, Amitabha Buddha, created out of compassion for all humanity, all suffering beings, to support them in their growth. And again, one element of that is slowing down time so that you can actually work through the unfulfilled desires and the unexpressed emotions that you experienced when you were physically embodied. But there are many smaller levels. So for example, there may be somebody who is an empath who's not that developed and shows up as a kind of social worker in the afterlife and has an afterlife adjustment group for the people who suddenly discover that they don't have bodies and that time moves differently and so on. Now, those realms are constantly growing as your own consciousness expands enough to be of service to those beings. And so obviously there's a kind of hierarchy there that is dependent on how expansive and how much you can embrace within your consciousness. All of the types have these levels of development when we're not physically embodied. So the kind of holding space that you asked about is very much an empath thing. But the idea of voidness, that's a mystical thing. And voidness as the ultimate reality seems to be a contradiction, but the ultimate truth is energy without labeling, and an ability to experience that energy as truth without converting it, translating it into images, into thoughts, into feelings, just being aware of exactly what it is in a completely non-conceptual way. We almost can't conceive of it. Other questions before I go on to the seers? Okay, So this one is the easiest one for me to talk about because it's the one that I know. And hopefully I'll present the dark side of the seer too, in the process of telling you all about myself. So the seers have a great facility with imagery. And so for me, when I was a young person, very, very vivid dreams, all night long, dreams of other worlds, other kinds of beings, cemeteries, dreams of cemeteries, which I think had to do with the afterlife. Colorful, in many respects more real than anything I experienced when I was going to school, in the public school system. And I really, especially during my teenage years, I lived for going into the dream world. Not just to sleep as long as I could, but because there was so much going on there that was so interesting. Not everybody dreams like that. Not everybody dreams in images. Not everybody remembers their dreams. But it is a key to being a seer. So, other than that, I wouldn't say I had any particular clairvoyant abilities. I couldn't see auras at that time. I didn't know what chakras were. I always wished I could see a ghost, but I never did see one. My mom saw one once, so that was, a very interesting thing for me. I loved reading ghost stories. When I was in elementary school, I would borrow a ghost story book from the library and sit with my friends in the shadow of the school building and read the stories to them. I think this is also an element of what it means to be a seer because there's so much work that you do in the afterlife. So that was kind of a preparation. I always loved study. I always loved gathering information. I always loved systematizing information. When I was in high school, I got interested in the Greek gods. And so I read an ancient text by Hesiod called Theogony, which is about the birth of the gods and the development of the gods. It's a very messy book because it brings in lots of different myths all in one place. So I decided I had to sort it out. And so I was probably 14 or 15 years old and I made many poster board charts of which gods came from where and who was the father and the mother of which god. And as you can see, I never stopped. I got interested, for example, in the Mayan calendar system. And I spent 2 years studying that to figure out what day I was born on in that Mayan calendar system. That required that I read 5 books about different ways of correlating the European and the Mayan calendar, and then decide which one was the most likely one, and then updating it 400 years to my birthday. Okay, so information, that's the main thing that I want to put across here. Seers get involved with information, collecting it, systematizing it, and so on. Music, even composing music, always seeing that in terms of systems of delivery of information. This is deeply embedded in my character. So by the time I got to college, it was clear that I had few social skills. And so one of the things I needed to learn while I was in college was how to have and make and sustain friends. So at this point, I was starting to learn some things about the union path. Also, I was having out-of-body experiences by then. This is another thing that typically happens for seers because of a fascination with the idea of bodies and planes. And at a certain point, I began reading some channeled writings by an entity named Seth, channeled by Jane Roberts. This was when I was in the university. And I really wanted to have that experience. I wanted to be a channel because I love the information. The only way I could get the information was to learn how to listen inwardly. And and how to sense the presence of other beings. And so this was another extension of my development along the lines of empath. And the mystic element came later. And I'm not sure exactly how to describe that. It's possible that when I found, how do I word this? The ability, here's the best way to say it. So when the mystic side is developed, there's an innate ability to understand the truth of the imagery that you're perceiving. So I had those amazing dreams when I was in high school, and I had no idea that they meant anything. So I started reading some Carl Jung, and then that began to help me understand the nature of dreams and symbols. And then I was beginning to sense the truth behind symbols. This ran somewhat parallel to the empathy aspect of things.
Carl Jung or C.G. Jung? C.G. Jung.
It's the same person. C stands for Carl.
Mm-hmm.
So Carl Gustav.
C.G. Jung,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to sense the truth behind things is always a challenge for seers. And I'll give you an example. Someone has a near-death experience. They die on an operating table. They go out of body. They travel in the afterlife. And they come back and they say, I went to heaven. I know it was heaven. Everything was gold. It was a city. Even the streets were paved with gold. Okay, that's an experience. However, I know now that that is an energetic reality, and gold means something other than what we think of as gold. So the real meaning of that experience, for example, would be, I know this is where I belonged because it was as valuable to me as gold. And then the truth starts to emerge. But if someone doesn't have that sense of the truth, they will say, no, there are roads in heaven, and they're paved with gold. In the same way that the spiritualists might say, no, it's grandma. So without that mystical sense of the truth, there's a lot of illusion. And to that extent, the mystic is right, wanting to leave behind the illusions. But I call the mystics the teachers because they teach us how to get in touch with the truth and realize the relativity of everything that we experience when we're dealing with imagery and with beings. But the soul healers are the ones, the empaths are the ones that embrace even the mystics in a sense of oneness and help them understand that's an aspect of God consciousness. And the seers are trying to help the mystics and the empaths understand each other because in a sense they have a foot in both worlds, as I explained earlier. So with respect to the question that came earlier about whether we have an inner mystic, whether we have an inner empath, we have all of these abilities because the wholeness of God is within us. Unfortunately, we can't realize it all at once. We do it in stages. And there's one place that we begin from in every lifetime, and then we have the challenge of adding these things back. And it's not easy. So for example, in one of my classes, I had a student for 15 years, brilliant seer, so much imagery. He still doesn't know what any of it means after 15 years. And I even have to stop him because if I let him go for too long, he will say, and the wallpaper had this color and this pattern on it. And of course, it means something, but if he doesn't know what it means, you just have to throw it away. Otherwise, you just get drowned in detail. Okay, so those are the three types. And I've given you some idea of what they are. Maybe you can recognize yourself. it might be easier. I would imagine most of you probably have at least two of the types operating. It may be that some, if not all of you, have three types operating, and so it would be a little more difficult to think about where you actually are in all of this, unless you can remember back to the days when there was a particular way of being. You know, the children that love animals, for example, are possibly empaths. You know, the ones that retreat into dreams are possibly seers. The ones who only care about playing chess and beating everyone are probably mystics. So, what? I'm being a little humorous when I'm saying that. It's an idea that I would like everyone to play with and feel a little bit about what this might mean to you and how it might support your growth. It's not having a membership card that you can flash to people. I'm a mystic, I'm a seer, I'm an empath. These are just tools. So, yes, here's a question. Art? Yeah.
Of course, it's not a question, but I think as children we play with all of these, and then eventually we set out using one as a teenager. That's at least how it was for me.
At least that's how it was for me. And that's one reason why I had to tell my personal story, so that you could understand the basis for why I'm talking about any of this. I think we could take a break now, and then afterwards, maybe we'll move in the direction of the practice. I think I need to go back to St. Michael's house to get the other